justice to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Odinaka. Again, that was excellent, and I know you were racing against time. So I appreciate that you were able to do all of that in 15 minutes, or just slightly over. I will now introduce Adedapo Adeniyi. And just so to foreshadow like what is to come, I know that we some of the sessions have bled over a little bit, so we are now, behind schedule. But the plan was to take like a 5 minute break. It might, like people can let us know if it makes sense to take the break just after this one. So we'll probably just reduce that to a minute or two so people can take toilet breaks and take water, etc. And then after the break, we'll be having Faith Oyewale, who, like I said earlier, most people just focus on the UK and the US, because all the role models we have gone either to the UK or the US. So a lot of people just concentrate on those jurisdictions. But Faith will be speaking about opportunities beyond the UK and the US, including Switzerland and some of the ways to excel as a graduate student in Europe and beyond. And then, like Odinaka said, we will be having Dr. Care Ellie, who will be speaking more specifically to writing a compelling PhD research proposal and landing a supervisor. And then after Care, we will have Mujib Jimoh, who will speak to the A to Z of landing an Ivy League university scholarship and U.S. immigration concerns, especially in the current climate, in Trump's United States. And then finally, we will have Rashid Ijaudola speak on the A to Z of applying to Stanford and other US masters, and then priming yourself for postgraduate opportunities, which I know for most people, a master's or a PhD is really just a way of leveling up. So it will be important for you to stay for that final session. And then finally, all the speakers will rejoin the meeting so we can take Q&As. I know some of you have questions or you just need to clarify certain points. So please, I know, this is all very important. So I hope that people will stay for the final session. So that said, let me introduce Adedapo Adeniyi. So Dapo serves as the Chief of Staff to the Chairman and CEO of Genesis Energy, a pivotal role in which he's entrusted with supporting the overall execution and advancement of the group's corporate strategy. In this capacity, he acts as a strategic advisor and key integrator, ensuring alignment and operational excellence across the organization. Dakpo holds a Master of Corporate Law degree from the University of Cambridge. This advanced legal training enables him to uniquely combine sharp analytical rigor with pragmatic business acumen. He is adept with navigating high-stakes environment. Dakpo is recognized for his strategic vision, meticulous attention to detail, and unwavering commitment to achieving transformative outcomes for Africa's energy sector. So Dakpo, if you're on, the floor is yours. I will be presenting your slides in a
stage.
Yes, I can see and hear you now.
All right. Good afternoon, stage. Good afternoon, everyone, and pleased to be here. I think on the very first edition, myself, Sage, and a few others were there as well, and I think that was shortly after I just started out at the University of Cambridge. Sage, whenever you're ready, you can just put it up.
Yeah.
So I'll get on with that. So I said, interestingly, the first edition, I was just still back at Cambridge. I think I'm in my first deals when we had the first round. And I think from then to now, it's been, I like to say, the reality of taking the MCL as opposed to the LLM based off my own judgment at the point in time. So I'll take the topic LLM and non-traditional master's degrees and the factors you should take into consideration. So typically you would I'll try to like limit my examples to Cambridge, Oxford, also understanding that this applies in a few other institutions as well. But that would just be the basis of the comparison. Yeah. So when I decided to get into Cambridge, right, for the MCL, it was born out of the decision that I realized I didn't want to go the typical LLM route, right, where you're just having the regular law courses, but I wanted a blend of practicality as to structuring, financing, and execution of deals, as well as alignment with the legal aspect. So we had courses like, the law and economics of deals, where you analyze structures, you analyze the financing, and a few other aspects. So it's been a ride, right, for me. And now I currently serve as the Chief of Staff to the Chairman and CEO, as well as VP Legal with Genesis Energy, with operations in about 11 to 12 countries. And that's to let you know the very first factor you should always take into consideration. Yes, so you can move on to the next slide. Take into consideration, right, is how you distinct what your core interest is really. So everyone just says, oh, I like the MCL because it's this, I like the LLM, and everyone has their potential choices, right, tailored to their own interest. So very quickly, I think we can just move on to the next one. Apologies, I think it was supposed to be a one-off stream yesterday. All right, great. So in terms of the factors to be considered, now I'll take this as practical and yet as theoretical as possible. I think, fortunately, my life sits at the intersection of strategy, legal, execution, has made me a bit more brief in my discussions and how I even right. So in terms of the curriculum, I think people initially always look for the best schools, right? I want to go to Oxford, I want to get Cambridge, I want to go to Harvard, without knowing exactly what it is they want to study. And I think the first point of actually even making a differentiation is understanding what your capacity is, understanding what your interests are, and understanding what career trajectory you'd like to have. So one thing I remembered this morning while just preparing for this was the fact that back in 2020, when I wrote my first application to the University of Cambridge, I'd written my short, long, and mid-term plans. And it's interesting that 5 years, 6 years afterwards, I sit directly at the intersection of what I had anticipated when I'd written my personal statement 5, 6 years ago. Now, that shows a bit of clarity, right? But also there is opportunity for you not to have an idea of what it is precisely you're going for. So the MCO was an intentional decision for me because I wanted to sit at the intersection of business and law, as opposed to the typical Sage, who is in the law firm. But interestingly, Sage is also the MLF guy that has blended law and finance together, and that's where the differentiation comes in. So the curriculum and the modules you take when you're taking the MCO differs largely from what you take on the LLM program. So the MCO is typically more intense compared to the traditional LLM, and that's literally the area of differentiation. And I think one of the unique factors, noted that there'll be questions afterwards, but I'll be happy to join afterwards. So one of the unique factors of the MCL over the LLM, notwithstanding the fact that each of them has specialty, would be the fact that you're able to interact with law practitioners or magic circle firms day one, right, on deals. So you're working on an acquisition financing deal, you're working on a venture capital deal. So those sort of structures, and I think more particularly is the fact that it's much more difficult getting on the MCL than the LLM, as well as getting on the MLF as opposed to the BCL due to the quota system, right? So typically you would have about 25 to 27% max on the MCL at Cambridge. I think about 40 thereabouts at Oxford. While on the LLM, it offers a broader range of admission criteria. That's where you have, I think, 189 to 200 thereabout. So in terms of the factors to be considered, right? The curriculum, so you have to. Now that's going to take me into the last part, which is making the right application. But first of all, you need to understand the requirements. It's surprising that you find out that some people tell you, "Oh, I want to go to Cambridge," and they have little or no idea what's been, or what going to Cambridge even looks like. They have no idea how to document their CVs, how to develop their personal statements, how to ensure that they're passing the right message across. So the very first thing you have to do is to ensure that you're researching into your school. You're researching into your program to understand what the requirements will be, as opposed to, the traditional LLM. And the good thing about the traditional LLM, right, as opposed to the specialized programs, would be the fact that you're able to combine a proper mix of what your interests are, as opposed to the MCL and the MLF. Now, if you know you're the corporate guy that wants to do deals, you want to go into the law firms, you want to sit on corporate finance team, you want to get into, an in-house role where you're leading project development, financing, and execution. You want to sit at that perfect intersection. The MCL, MLF might be the perfect fit for you. That's notwithstanding the fact that the LLM could still be a right mix for you as well. And that's why it's always more about what your interests are, what, your initial and future career trajectory is expected to look like. Good thing is, right, for the MCL, and I think the MCL admits just first class students. And I think one thing I wrote down on my slide is also the fact that you have to be as practical as possible with your applications. That's not to, discredit the 2-1, because trust me, if you make it to 1, you could be getting into Cambridge LLM as well, depending on how you, make your application sellable, to the admission body, as the case may be. And also checking your funding requirements. It's interesting because I think the MCL just released the funding that is rare. So you'd have the Albert Smith previously that would sponsor. But I hate to be the bearer of bad news. I know that everyone on call, I'm sure till now, has been talking about funding. But for the MCL, it's such specific that you'd hardly find any funding opportunity, save for external funding or college-based funding. So the chances of you securing a funding that's coming from college on the MCL is next to 1 to 2%. However, the choice and the ability to research into colleges. Now, I know Pembroke at Cambridge is one. I was at Fitzwilliam. Pembroke, there's, I think, Wolfson as well, and a few other colleges. And that's why researching into the school, researching into the program, and researching into the applicable colleges, right, would also get help in your funding opportunities. Now, one thing I'm sure everyone has spoken about, personal statement, but one thing I always like to say is the fact that your personal statement always has to sell a story, right? It's just the same way I look at project execution, right from origination to, COD right now. For you to secure funding, or for you to even convince certain DFIs, your lenders, oh yeah, this project is worth, taking the risk on, you need to ensure that you've been able to sell the project to yourself before you can sell it to the lenders. So, and that's why I'm always very particular when I review personal statements. You need to tell a story that intersects what your interests are, what your current plans, your mid and long-term plans will also look, and just find a way to bring it all together. Now, you can imagine a personal statement that could be as brief as possible, that you're going for the MCL, right? It's straight to a corporate law issue that currently affects global markets. And then you're letting them know, you woke up randomly on a morning and realized, oh, yeah, the inflation had caused this, caused that, competition issues. Just show that you're able to relate well to that story. And then, you're able to convince your admission bodies even faster and better. Right? You're also able to curate your experience over the years. And it's interesting when people come out most times, they're like, oh, I've just worked for a year. I don't feel like I've got the right experience that enables me to get into, the Ivy Leagues. But one thing I've been also consistent about is the fact that when I applied back to Cambridge for the very first time, I think I was just doing my NYC, right? And I put up some scrappy application, but based off my interest, because I knew I wanted to do stuff related to corporate law, I was able to make a blend of my previous internship experience. I've done, Citibank, with KPMG, with Stanbic and the likes. I was able to curate those experiences to show that, bruv, I've been interested in what this life is all about from the get-go, talking about my Etisalat, the fund syndication experiences. So it's all about how you're able to sell the story. Now describe your short, mid, and long-term goals. And like I said, it looks like I'm living in, I like to say, short to mid-term goal at the moment, sitting on boards, having that bird eye view in terms of corporate strategy, the legal strategy, and financing strategy. So I see that the intersection of having to understand literally everything about the financing, about the entire business, right? Despite being a lawyer. But the good thing about the background of the MCL, which has helped me to now, is the fact that on a daily basis, I'm analyzing risk. I'm ensuring or I'm finding out how to mitigate this risk as best as possible to ensure the success of businesses. And to take me to the very last slide, right? I told Sage I want to spend so much time. Fortunately, the career opportunities, that could emanate from degrees such as the MLF, the MCL, masters in corporate commercial law, specializations in energy, the quite a few specialized degrees that differs largely from the LLM, and this could put you, in good standing when you're making your TC applications, right? So if you're at that level where or you feel like you've barely gotten an experience, but you'd like to get on with a master's degree, I think now is the right time to start even looking at potential training contract applications to ensure that, once you finish your master's, timelines might just look very right. You could get in you could get lateral roles, just like, Sage here, Northern Roles. You could get into emerging programs, right, that gives you a bird eye view into what working in a city law firm would look like. You could also get in-house roles, and I think that was my that's always been my path, weirdly, and I think I get that joke a lot around myself and a few of my friends. Like, that was always been the in-house guy. I think very early on, I realized what I wanted to do, made it with a bit of law firm experience in the initial stage, but then got settled into the real in-house work that I've been doing. Worked at Energy back in London as well, and now with Genesis Energy across a few other countries. And you could decide to go the route of Odinaka. Interestingly, I think I'm very familiar with Odinaka's brother, meaning you could literally end up your MLF or your MCO program and decide, you know what, I'd like to do a bit more research into what shared activism and its implication could look like, based off Odinaka's expert advice. But in a summary, and in a nutshell, I think that it's always good to seek clarity, right? The LLM, the MCO, the differ, as well as, with other programs and other schools. So it's always good to have your research done. It's always good to ensure that you're peer reviewing your personal statement. It doesn't hurt to write it 3, 4, 5 times, have it for peer review and ensure that, you're putting your best foot forward as best as possible. Describe yourself, make it personal, trust me, I feel like right now, compared to 7, 8 years ago, when going to Ivy League schools, potentially the Harvard, the Cambridge, the Oxford, um, and the number of them, going to these schools felt like, a dream that was distant and afar. But trust me, I feel like with testimony stories over the last particularly 10 years, I think the number of Nigerians and Africans that are breaking into these sort of leagues and these sort of categories makes it more than possible. And something else that I also advise would be, for these specialized courses, it's always also good to look into external fundings. Like I said, funding from your colleges, funding from, Commonwealth, funding from the Black Arts. The few, scholarship bodies that are always open, year in, year out, that would make quite a lot of sense, and trust me, the minute you're in, it could only get better. So I think, Sage, I'll take the questions later on. Conscious there will be some. Thank you.
Yeah, that is correct. So we will take the Q&A at the end of all the sessions. Thank you again, Dakwa. That was masterfully done. Like I said, we will take a 2-minute break, so people